Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's new digital platform that will enable you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting www.jewishinsider.com. Today, we will be discussing the importance of the Transatlantic Partnership. We are honored to be joined by two close friends and partners of AJC, U.S. Congressman Ted Deutch, who serves as chairman of the House Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and International Terrorism, and Lukas Mandl, a member of European Parliament from Austria and the chair of Transatlantic Friends of Israel. Our conversation will be moderated by AJC's Deputy Director of Policy and Diplomatic Affairs, Julie Fishman-Raymond. The concept for today's program was born out of AJC's Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, which in July 2019 launched Transatlantic Friends of Israel. Transatlantic Friends of Israel is a cross-party, interparliamentary group dedicated to the post-war order of transatlantic security and cooperation. Through AJC's presence and perseverance in both Brussels and Washington, we are committed to bringing together parliamentarians on both sides of the Atlantic to tackle the most pressing issues of our time. After we hear from our panelists, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions is plural, @ajc.org, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Julie, you and our esteemed panelists have the floor.
Thank you so much, Ali, and thank you to all of our viewers today. Like you said, Ali, a lot of this conversation is meant to be a status report. Where are we in terms of the state of transatlantic relationship? What are the challenges? Where are the hopes? What can we be doing together across the Atlantic and frankly, across all parties to be bringing the United States and Europe closer together at a really critical time? I want to launch right in by talking about the Transatlantic Friends of Israel project initiative that AJC started, and you both have signed on to be a part of it. Signing on to a declaration calling on the EU to fully and entirely designate Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. Mr. Mandl, you're the chair of this enterprise, and it's really a remarkable thing that we shouldn't diminish or take for granted. Not only does it bring together policymakers from the United States and Europe, which in and of itself is quite a feat, it does so in the name of supporting Israel. And so I want to ask you, when you're reaching out to other members of the European Parliament to be a part of this initiative, what is the bigger ask? Do your fellow parliamentarians bristle more at the transatlanticism of the enterprise, or is it more about the pro-Israel bent? Or to put it more positively, which part of this are they gravitating towards more?
Thanks for the invite, first of all. I'm more than happy to talk to you. In my home constituency, Austria, it's 6:05 p.m. at the moment. In the United States, it's 12, I guess. And I'm more than happy to talk to you. Actually, both of it is relevant, the strong relation to Israel as well as the one to the United States. But the whole initiative, I would say, is first and foremost based on reason. Because Hezbollah is a security threat to Israel, that's for sure, and that's clear. And it's a proxy of Iran. But Hezbollah is a security threat for all the world, especially also for Europe. It has committed attacks also within Europe. And as we all know, these terrorist networks work globally. And there is not a political wing and a terrorist wing or something like that. There is one organization that's really a threat to all of us, like the whole connection between the US, the EU, and Israel in our Transatlantic Friends of Israel group in European Parliament, which is multi-partisan. This whole connection is based on common interest in security and, of course, in other fields. And the Hezbollah initiative is already running and has been running for a couple of months. But actually, the German decision to ban Hezbollah entirely from the side of the German government was a boost to our initiative in European Parliament. And that's why I hope we will achieve a lot with this initiative.
The US position on Hezbollah tends to be quite uniform. We tend to see good bipartisan support in terms of thwarting Hezbollah's efforts towards terrorist financing and terrorist threats in and of themselves. Congressman Deutch, you've tried to persuade colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic for years. You've really led a number of initiatives talking about the threat of Hezbollah, trying to encourage the EU to designate it. Knowing that Germany has now taken this step, what do you think the next steps are for the United States and for American leadership, congressional leadership, in trying to sort of build off of this success?
It's a great question, Julie, and I'm actually going to just back up for a second and thank you for moderating. It's great to see you. It's great to be with Lukas. And just for those who are watching or listening who don't know, Julie is a constant presence on Capitol Hill, and we're grateful for all of the work that you do. You're always accessible. Jason Isaacson is always accessible to members of Congress and to our staffs. We're really appreciative. I wanted to say a quick hello to David Harris, if he's on today, and to let him know how grateful we are for, David, for your excellent stewardship of AJC for all these years, but especially for your leadership of the in so many ways of the global Jewish community. So it's great to be with you. I want to thank AJC for keeping these international issues front and center during these really challenging times, and that's why I think this is really so important. And finally, just as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, where I chair the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee, chair the Congressional Study Group on Germany, the Congressional Hellenic Israel Alliance, and the chair of the Bipartisan Task Force on Combating Anti-Semitism, there has never been a panel that I've been on that so perfectly captures the things that I care about. So thanks so much. It's really terrific to be here. As far as the steps with Hezbollah, I want to just first follow up on what Lukas said and talk about the importance of the transatlantic relationship, because we're having this call in the midst of this global pandemic. It's the perfect illustration of why these partnerships are so important. We're absolutely stronger when tackling these challenges alongside our transatlantic partners, whether it's securing medical supplies or pushing back against Chinese misinformation, rebuilding our economies. We are in this together, and it reminds us of all of the other things that we need to work on together. So in terms of this step with Hezbollah, it's really significant what Germany did. I have focused for some time now on pressing our allies to recognize that there is no distinction. You can't make a false distinction between a political arm of a terrorist organization and a military arm of a terrorist organization. Ultimately, it is still one and the same, and that's a terror group. And that's why the decision that Germany made is so significant to our ability to continue to press other countries now to follow this strong, important step that Germany took in standing up to Hezbollah and in standing up to terrorism. Last thing I'll say on this is we have, as I said, we have so many ways that the United States and our transatlantic partners can work together, and it's so important for us to recognize all of them. But there's nothing more important here or in Europe than taking action to keep our communities safe. That means standing up to Hezbollah. It also means standing up for and with Israel, which is why I'm so grateful to Lukas for the work he's doing to chair the Transatlantic Friends of Israel group.
Indeed, talking about Israel, because at the end of the day, the threat posed by Hezbollah is a global threat, but it is disproportionately targeted towards Israel. I'm curious, Congressman Deutch, you mentioned your role as the chair of the subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa. Can you talk about some of the conversations that you're having with fellow members of Congress about Israel now? What are the challenges there? And can you speak specifically about sort of the state of bipartisan support for Israel on Capitol Hill right now?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And look, those, just to continue where we just left off, those conversations are in large part focused on the threat that Iran poses. That'll transition right into Israel. But when you look at the threat Iran poses and you look at its support for Hezbollah and the fact that Hezbollah has this history of launching attacks around the world, fundraising all around the world, but really focusing on what's been happening, what Hezbollah has been doing in Lebanon, obviously, that affects Israel's security, what Hezbollah is doing in Syria that affects Israel's security. This is one of the things that's helped bring Congress together around these issues. We just sent a letter, I'm sure most of your viewers know, we just sent this letter, 387 members of Congress sent a letter to the administration urging extension of the arms embargo against Iran. That's I think, indicative of the kind of bipartisan support that exists. This is a question I'm asked about a lot, and the support for Israel in the United States Congress remains overwhelmingly bipartisan. Our record shows it. Congress in July condemned the BDS movement. We passed that with over 400 votes. We passed a bipartisan resolution affirming our commitment to two states and our security assistance to Israel. We unanimously passed my legislation to strengthen and broaden the contacts between the United States and Israel. So it's very strong. I won't pretend that there aren't challenges, and those on this call are sophisticated enough to acknowledge them, but the foundation of the support for Israel continues to be strong. And the last point I'll make on this is, as a community, it's really important that we stand up to those who wish to politicize support for Israel. I think it's important to do that whether they're doing it on the left or on the right. That's really critical, and strong pro-Israel voices, again, on both sides of the aisle need to make that point. The best thing for the U.S.-Israel relationship is the support in Congress. It's also ensuring that support continues to be strong and bipartisan, that no one tries to use it for political purposes.
Lukas, you know Israel well, and in fact traveled to Israel with AJC on one of our Project Interchange seminars. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how Israel is viewed specifically in the European Parliament, sort of dovetailing on the question I posed to Congressman Deutch. Do your peers understand what Israel brings to the table? Do they understand that cooperation with Israel is not a favor to the state, but rather something that is mutually beneficial?
That's a very important question. Thank you, Julie. First of all, also thanks to Congressman Deutch for the kind words, and also for this strong partnership across the ocean between EU and our initiatives and the US. And the bipartisan support for Israel in the US is and has always been a great example of how to defend the so-called Western values, human dignity, individual freedom, on a global scale, on a global level. And that's what the bipartisan approach in the US means, in my view. And that's what's a great example to the world. And I hope this remains a clear position which is not politicized, as Congressman Deutch already said. And when I say it's a good example, of course, the EU should receive this example and understand it, and be in the future, one day, as supportive for Israel as the US is. Because this is, as you said, Julie, in your question, it's not a favor. That's so important. It's in mutual interest, not only regarding the values, which are always, of course, the most important aspect, but also it's a matter of interest when it comes to economy, innovation, exchange in many different fields, the startups, scenery, the whole economy, And of course, also security. We should never forget about that. Israel is a security provider, not only for itself, not only for the Middle East, but for the whole region and also for Europe, of course. So the closer we work together, the more secure we are, and the more our economies can grow and innovation can happen in these parts of the world where we, in the first place, want innovation to happen, where the before mentioned values are in place. In European Parliament, Julie, since you have asked, there are a lot of supporters of Israel, and I have to underline, of course, there are a lot in my political group, the EPP, but also a lot of supporters in the other, I would call them reasonable groups, and that's why the Transatlantic Friends of Israel group is a multi-partisan group and consists of great representatives from different countries and also from different political groups. But what we still have are some different opinions from what I have already said regarding the Israel relation in some of the EU member states, which play a crucial role in Europe also for foreign policy. That's a difference to the US, as we all know. And we also have, I would say, in the extreme corners of the European Parliament, at the very left and at the very right, we have problems like anti-Zionism, or at least not understanding what's in the interest of Europe and of the European citizens in the relation with Israel, and that's what we have to. That's what we have to fight each and every day. But I guess never before such a group like the Transatlantic Friends of Israel has been in place in European Parliament, and that's why my hopes are large for this running mandate in European Parliament, that we can achieve a lot in many different fields when it comes to the association agreement and other fields that are important in the relation with Israel, when it comes to concrete political action that has to be taken.
In typical fashion with conversation with policymakers, we dove right into the challenges, right? Talking about Israel and Hezbollah and Iran. And I want to take a quick step back before we turn to the audience for questions to talk generally about the state of the Transatlantic Alliance. And ask both of you from your perspectives, perhaps Lukas, you can answer first. Where are we? How strong is the transatlantic partnership? What do we need to be doing as, as fervent believers? We are in fact the choir that is preaching and is being preached to at this moment. What can we be doing? What are those specific strategies that we can be doing to bolster the alliance at this time of real need?
I guess most important is to talk to each other and to find common ways to achieve a solution, or in some cases to achieve a solution on different ways, but to keep with the same goal on both sides, in the US and in the EU. And that's for example, the case with the nuclear deal with Iran. We all know EU has a different position there as the US when it comes to the how-to question. But the clear goal that Iran must never be a nuclear power state remains the same in the US and the EU, and we have to underline and to coordinate, I would say, more than ever, to coordinate our action in fields like this. And even if there are misunderstandings, of course, we also have to work together on an economic level, because rule of law and investments and values and a good situation on the labor market, for example, are connected and remain connected. And if we want the parts of the world which we call the parts which know and live Western values to be successful, we have to remain connected. And of course, we share a pretty similar way of life.
Congressman, want to add to that, and maybe specifically what we do when we do disagree?
Well, I have been working on strengthening the transatlantic relationship since I've been in Congress, and I can tell you that, and Lukas knows this, there's always concern. That's what gets the headline. So during the last administration, when I traveled to Europe, when I traveled to Brussels, when I was in Germany and elsewhere, we kept being asked about the pivot to Asia And is America turning away from Europe? And why is this being done? And we always reassured our European colleagues that that wasn't the case. Now we get questions about this administration turning inward and whether that means, and some of the comments made about NATO and the EU, and whether that means that there's a diminishing connection to Europe and the transatlantic relationship. And what I remind my colleagues, and what I remind everyone on this call at this meeting is that the relationship is still very strong, especially and perhaps strongest in Congress. I'm a member of the Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism. That brings together parliamentarians from around the world to fight anti-Semitism, and that's got its base in Europe. The same thing is true in the work that I do when we work together through the Congressional Study Group on Germany. There's an interparliamentary group on NATO. There's a transatlantic legislators group. There are so many ways that, and Lukas knows this because he's involved in so many of them, there's so many ways that those of us who represent parts of the United States have the opportunity to come together with elected officials from Europe and recognize the shared values that we have and the shared concerns we have. And as I mentioned before, we're doing this in the middle of a global pandemic, emphasis on global, and only by working together with our allies, especially like our allies in Europe, will we have the opportunity to help lead our way out of this. And that's, we're reminded every day right now about how important the relationship is.
As we're talking about the importance of communication, I think it's a great time to turn to Allie and questions from the audience. Allie?
Sure. Thank you all so much. I just want to remind our audience that if you have questions, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom, or you can email your question to questions, that's questions plural, at ajc.org. Our first question comes from Mike in Detroit. This question is for Congressman Deutch. You've endorsed Joe Biden for president. How do you think a potential Biden administration will approach the Transatlantic Alliance and our relationship with Israel?
That's such a great question, and especially it's a perfect follow-up to what I was just saying about our reassurances that we've been extending to our transatlantic partners. When we were in all of those times that I mentioned in the last administration, when we went to Munich, for example, there's one that stands out in particular. We were in Munich for the Munich Security Conference, which is a vital, it's a vital program that brings together leaders from Europe and from the United States to focus on all of the shared security threats that we have. And there was a lunch where Vice President Biden gave a stirring speech in defense of the transatlantic relationship, really to help put at ease those partners of ours from the region who were suggesting that perhaps America had somehow lost that same commitment that had always existed. So we've heard it from the Vice President Biden talking about those issues. We know how strongly he feels about international relations and the relationships that he's made over the years. He knows everyone in every part of the globe, and that's especially true in Europe, where he's worked with so many of the current leaders and understands how intertwined the growth and development of Europe and its economy and its security are with that of the United States. And then as far as Israel, I think it's fair to say that probably everyone participating today has had the opportunity over the years to hear Vice President Biden talk about the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship, share with us the deep knowledge he has from his many, many trips, from his from serving as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, the close personal relationships that he has with everyone from Prime Minister Netanyahu going back through so many other prime ministers. I think a lot of people have heard him tell the story of Golda Meir. This is something that comes to Vice President Biden in his core. He clearly understands why the ongoing strong bipartisan support for Israel is not only in Israel's best interest, but is clearly in the United States' best interest from a national security perspective, and because we share the same values, the same commitment to human rights and democracy. So I'm proud to support Vice President Biden, and that's in large part because I know that he stands where I stand on the importance of strengthening the U.S.-Israel relationship.
Great, thank you.
Before you move on to the next question, I want to piggyback on that just for one moment, because, and of course, AJC is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization, but I can't let this moment pass without mentioning a pledge that we put forward in the shape of an ad in the New York Times in September of 2018. It was a pledge of unity, reaffirming the transatlantic partnership at a time when it was very much in question, when U.S. commitment to NATO was very much in question. And AJC brought together dozens of very high-level policymakers from both sides of the Atlantic, and indeed from all political parties. And Vice President Biden was one of our initial and very early signers of that pledge. So for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's available on AJC's website. And it's really notable that a number of the themes that we were talking about in 2018 are still the themes that are being discussed today. The need for an international rules-based order, the confidence in NATO, respect for the EU, all of those things that have come out in this conversation and through so many AJC conversations.
Thanks, Julie. Our next question comes from AJC CEO David Harris, who is indeed on the line. David says, "Hi, Lukas. Hi, Ted. Thank you for being such good friends of AJC. Lukas, what explains the resistance to recognizing the entirety of Hezbollah by the European Union? Does it largely derive from French opposition, or is it broader?" And David also has a question for you, Congressman Deutch, which is, as we move away from both the immediate post-war era and the Cold War, do you see the same level of interest in the transatlantic partnership among newer members of Congress of both parties, or is time working against us and interest slowly fading? So Lukas, let's start with you.
Well, of course, there are some parts in European member states especially who claim we would lose diplomatic contact with Lebanon if we ban Hezbollah entirely. But the US example shows that the opposite is possible and works very well. It's possible to ban Hezbollah entirely and to keep with the diplomatic relations with Lebanon, as well as to fight terror. And Hezbollah is a terrorist organization entirely, and that's why we are, I would say, a little behind the US in this question due to different approaches from different member states. I also try to talk about that and negotiate about that with colleagues from these specific member states. But only a few days ago, Germany gave this whole purpose a large push forward by its decision. Of course, Austria is always in the forefront since Sebastian Kurz has been prime minister, and other European countries follow, and more parliamentarians in European Parliament sign this declaration, and that's why I have pretty much hope, and I'm optimistic that we will reach a lot with that. And frankly, the second part of the questions was not that easy to understand for me. I don't want to miss to respond to it as long as I can understand it.
Oh, sure. The second part was, does it derive from French opposition?
Well, it's not only French, but it's also French, I would say. And that's why I especially talk to French colleagues about that, very clear. Also colleagues who are friends but there are also other parts of the European Parliament who may oppose. But again, the number of committed parliamentarians is growing, and we keep on running for that.
So I'll take the second piece of that, and I actually I think to the contrary. And first of all, David, it's great to be with you. While it is true that that there is a new generation of House members who have been coming in, particularly in the last election, it's important to think about who those members are. And on the Foreign Affairs Committee, it's true generally, but especially on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we have so many new members who have national security backgrounds, intelligence backgrounds. They understand the national security implications of this discussion, and why having friends and working with friends across the ocean, why in the transatlantic relationship is so critically important to meeting our shared national security interests. But beyond that, there is a real sense, especially at this moment, that, as Julie alluded to from that ad, the rules-based order is under attack in places around the world, and there is no one better situated to respond to attacks on that rules-based order, the attacks on liberal democracies, than the United States, working arm in arm with our transatlantic allies who also understand why this is so critically important. We face a moment now that is giving us the chance to pause. This pandemic is helping us realize, as I said earlier, that we're all fighting this together, but it's also giving us the opportunity to think about what the world is going to look like when we come out of it. And there are places where leaders have used this pandemic to try to advance authoritarian interests, which highlights for me and for my colleagues, whether they're veterans or whether they're in their first term, how important American leadership working with our transatlantic partners is in making sure that those advances don't get anywhere, and in protecting the rules-based order that we've helped to lead on.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Representative Mandl, and it's from Henry in Berlin. Austria's ties with Israel have been improving steadily over the past half year. Do you think the tide is turning in Europe, and that there is growing support for Israel?
Yes, I think so. Sebastian Kurz, Prime Minister of Austria, has been in the forefront already when he was Foreign Minister, and now as Prime Minister, Chancellor of Austria, he's practicing this due to the before-mentioned values and due to the before-mentioned interest from economy to security, and that's why I would not only say others follow, because Austria is beautiful but small in Europe, but the example itself shows that it is possible not to be anywhere in between, but clearly to support the only rule of law state, the only democracy, the only state which is a really reliable partner in the whole Middle East. And that's why maybe I don't want to be too optimistic, but in my view, things get better in this regard, and that's what we try to work on. And this must be true for all over Europe, because Europe has to speak with one voice. This is the old issue. You know it in the United States and everywhere in the world. We have a lot of strength, and we can contribute a lot to the world due to many different reasons, but we have to speak in a global political and diplomatical context and level with one voice, and this should be achieved especially when it comes to Israel.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Richard Cohen, a board member of AJC's in Westchester, and it's to you, Congressman Deutch. Vice President Biden pledged in debates to have America rejoin the original JCPOA. Would you support that move? And would a revived JCPOA give sanctions relief to Iran and allow them to pour more money into funding Hezbollah?
I actually, I've had conversations with the Biden campaign. I'm confident, given Vice President Biden's long-standing, deep understanding of foreign policy, his understanding of how important diplomacy is, and certainly being well aware of the threats that Iran poses. He understands that we were at a point when President Trump withdrew from the Iran deal. And just to be clear, I did not support the Iran deal for a whole host of reasons, but I also didn't support pulling out of it because, in large part, we were having negotiations with our European allies about how to address the very shortfalls that caused me to oppose it in the first place, how to address the challenges with inspections, how to address the fact that ballistic missiles and the ballistic missile program was not included, how to make sure that we're focused on Iran's malign activities in the region. All of the sunset clauses, the problems that existed with the deal, we were negotiating with our allies. So if we're going to re-enter the deal, I don't believe that anyone would think it makes sense to pretend that things haven't changed since the deal was negotiated. We now understand how serious these shortfalls are, especially as we get to some of the ends of the sunset provisions. And so the negotiations would be, and what Vice President Biden would do would be to work with our allies to help strengthen the deal, to help lengthen the term of the deal, to address the shortfalls that were in it, all for the benefit of preventing Iran, all toward the original goal of preventing Iran from ever acquiring the capability to build nuclear weapons. So I think the Vice President's background on this issue, his understanding of these issues, and his ability to lead our international partners toward strengthening the deal is what I would look forward to working with him on should he be elected president.
And Congressman, I want to add in for the viewers who may not know, the position that you outlined, your position, opposition to the JCPOA originally, and then concern about U.S. withdrawal was almost exactly AJC's position. And in fact, one of the reasons that we cited for concern about withdrawal was in fact that it could drive a wedge between the U.S. and Europe and our European allies. So thank you.
Sure.
Great. Our next question comes from Carrie in Pittsburgh. And this is actually to both of you, but we'll start with Representative Mandl first. Is there room for further transatlantic cooperation on fighting anti-Semitism and extremism? How do we tackle the differences that our respective countries may have on free speech, and specifically in the United States, the First Amendment?
Well, maybe Congressman Deutch is the one who could rather respond to the First Amendment question. But of course, it's extremely important that the European Union in each and every regard follows what its own decision has been only 1 year ago or a little more regarding anti-Semitism and what's meant with anti-Semitism, how it is defined. And this was important. It was a decision in the European Parliament as well as in other European institutions that anti-Semitic activities are the ones from the old, awful European, German-speaking countries based in most of the cases anti-Semitism, but also the one of migrants from Islamistic backgrounds, and thirdly, the one that's called anti-Zionism, so to question the right to exist for the state of Israel, or to want to erase Israel from the map. These three types of anti-Semitism have been decided on, and this was a very elementary decision, I would say, due to the fact that in each and every political field, when it comes to education, to media, to science, actually, the academia, and of course security, in each and every field we have to follow our own decision, and this is something new on the European level. This is clear and more clarified than ever before, and that's why I see opportunities to use this new definition to fight anti-Semitism, which is actually in some parts of Europe rising. So we should not forget that we have a rising trouble here in some parts of Europe, and it becomes more and more complex due to social media and other aspects, and that's why we have to have a close look all the time on everything that's going on, but not only have a look, but take action, as mentioned, from security to education in many different fields.
I'm happy to tackle the First Amendment issue. First, though, I thank the EU Parliament for adopting the IRA definition. I think this is a really important step. I am a strong defender of the First Amendment. I do not believe that we should limit anyone's right to be able to express their opinion. I do think, consistent with that, it is also our right to point out when those words are anti-Semitic, and whether it is singling out Israel as the one Jewish state in the world and also the one state that does not have a right to exist, or pinning all of the issues of the world, all of the challenges that we face on Israel in almost exactly the same way this was done on the Jews, where Israel takes the place of the Jews in what's otherwise classic anti-Semitism. It's helpful to be able to identify that as anti-Semitism. I think that we have to continue to speak out about it. We have to be clear that anti-Semitism can't be tolerated, whether it is on the right or on the left. I think that's critical. We need to be able to call it out, whether it comes from our own political party, which is, I acknowledge, sometimes harder, but even more important, or whether it comes from opposing political parties. The fact is, we've got to be willing to stand up, because it's going to start with our willingness to do that. That's what leads others. And here we are in the midst of this pandemic. No one could have, well, perhaps we should have expected, but the level of anti-Semitism that still exists, the cases of anti-Semitism, the violence and intimidation that in many ways have now moved online during this pandemic, that we worry. I talked to ambassadors, Lukas, from Europe, who now worry about that anti-Semitism spilling from Zoom out into the community when these orders are lifted. This is something we have to continue to speak out about. And finally, in Congress, we've devoted a lot of resources to securing our community institutions. That's done in partnership with local law enforcement and DHS, Department of Homeland Security. And I think that's the kind of thing that we can work on with our international partners and friends. The Interparliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism gives us a forum to do that. And we see these alarming connections between, we've seen this more and more, the connections between extremist groups in Europe and the United States. We have international terrorism in our jurisdiction of our subcommittee. And the last thing I'll say on this is we've spent a lot of time looking at the rise of white nationalist groups, white identity terrorism, and the transnational connections between these groups. The administration has now taken action to designate foreign terrorist organization, one of these groups as a foreign terrorist organization. That's the kind of thing that we need to continue to focus on as we work together to combat these shared threats.
Thank you both so much. This is our last question before I hand it back to you, Julie, for some closing remarks. Stephen in Toronto writes, China and Russia are flexing their muscle and assertiveness in the US and in Europe. Do you see room for further transatlantic cooperation on these two issues, or is there too much internal discord on these issues, both in the US and in Europe, to even begin to improve transatlantic cooperation on these issues? Lukas, we'll start with you.
Thank you for the question. I'd like to put it with an example. We have the Western Balkans, the 6 states of the Western Balkans: Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. And these are parts of Europe, clearly. When you have a look on the map, they are nearly in the center of Europe, but they are not yet EU members. And the EU has lost Great Britain and Northern Ireland due to the obvious reasons, and it's a weakness for Europe, as well for the UK, but also for the European Union that we have lost them. I always say we should not lose the Western Balkans as well, even when they are not yet members of EU. Why do I tell that? Because this is a perfect example of where influence from other parts of the world who don't share our common values, the transatlantic values, try to be, I would say, impulsive and to be influential, to gain economic successes there, or to spread political Islam, for example, and others. So that's one field where we have to fight together to decrease those influences. Of course, I'm pretty convinced that, and Congressman Deutch already said something like this, we are all together in this pandemic, and it shows us once again, maybe more than many years before, that we all belong together, we need each other on this planet, but we can remain convinced that our Western values are the ones that will help us to fight for the individual rights and everything else, and for rule of law. And rule of law is the thing that has to remain in place, and democracy is also a thing that has to remain in place, and that's not the case in Russia, and obviously not in China, and also in other parts of the world. I would also mention Turkey from my side, which is of course a NATO member state, but not very close to the values NATO is supposed to defend. I would say those interests are threatening, I would say, peace in the world and security in the world, and that's why we have to work together, of course, also in this field. But we should fight the so-called hybrid risks from these parts of the world. It's not the one risk like maybe in the 20th century in a military sense alone. It's also risk via influence via social media and conspiracy theories and so on, and trying to split up our societies in many different aspects. And these are the fields where we have to fight these hybrid threats from these parts of the world, while always keeping in contact. Maybe this is also a European approach, that we usually do not stop to talk to each other, because it's important to talk to each other, and as long as you talk to each other, you don't shoot, and this seems also important to me, as long as it is possible.
That's a very powerful and a very eloquent response to that question. I guess I would just sum up Lukas's eloquent words by returning to what we've been talking about throughout. There is a commitment that exists among the United States and our transatlantic partners to democracy and to the rules-based order and the rule of law that does not exist in these other countries. And as those two countries in particular may not share the same commitment, do not share the same commitment to human rights and to democracy, we're going to see this. We've seen efforts to destabilize these democracies. There's nothing that advances the interests of other countries like that than trying to sow discord in our own countries, and to try to cause a rift between the United States and its transatlantic partners. That's what we cannot allow to happen. We're heading into an election season. We know that there will be efforts here, just as we've seen efforts in Europe, all throughout Europe, to try to undermine the foundation of our democracy, the people's belief in our institutions, the shared commitment that we have to advancing these values. And only by working together, the United States with our transatlantic partners, will we be able to strengthen those values. That's going to be helpful, not just for this relationship, but ultimately it's going to be helpful for the rest of the world when we provide that kind of leadership.
Thank you so much to both of our panelists. You have been generous with your time and candid with your insights. And over the course of the last hour, I think we've barely scratched the surface in talking about the issues that abound, but can take some comfort in the fact that we haven't just been talking about reaffirming the Transatlantic Alliance. We have, through this conversation, in action, reaffirmed the Transatlantic Partnership. So thank you so much for being a part of that affirmation, a part of that ongoing commitment, and know that AJC will never take that for granted.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Julie. Great to be with you, Lukas.
All the best. Take care. Regards to Florida and to NYC.
Ali, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Thank you for that fascinating discussion, and to two longtime friends of AJC. And thanks to our partners at Jewish Insider. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from family and friends, AJC is bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue standing up for the Jewish people, for Israel, and for the values that unite us all. Visit ajc.org/donate. Our next Advocacy Anywhere program will be tomorrow, May 7th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern. We'll be exploring the ways in which hate, extremism, and anti-Semitism flourish on social media. We hope you'll join us. Please stay safe and healthy, everyone. Good day.